So we're going to do a case study today, and we're going to talk about head position, and we're going to kind of talk about the relationship between head position and athletic performance as one variable, and head position and different kinds of injuries or kind of beneficial or potentially harmful postures associated with head position. So that's our general topic today, and since Diane's up on screen, I'll let her run with this.
So first, let me start off by saying, this is our original parking lot of dreams here in San Francisco. And what you'll notice, aside from this stellar example of me doing a double kettlebell overhead squat, is you'll notice that, shape-wise, we're looking at a little bit of overextension in the back. Elbows are a little bit soft. Head is a little bit forward. Feet are relatively straightish. I've always had pretty good ankle and hip range of motion, but clearly we've just got some stuff swimming upstream, and I'm using my head really hard to create a tension point to hold the structure together.
Yeah, so when I look at this, I've known Diane for a really long time, and I've always thought this is just pretty good hip and ankle flexibility. But, when I look at just this half of the system, what we see is we have a couple of extension points and they kind of stack, right? So any one of these could be the fault, right? It could be because we're overextending here. Now you're sending your shoulder further back to compensate and keep the weight stacked. And the only way to balance that equation is to push your head through.
Right.
Equally likely is you could be losing it at the wrist, where we're softening the wrist position, which is causing you to have to push your head forward because you're not getting as active of a shoulder position.
Right.
And so this is, there's about 8 chickens and 6 eggs in here. I don't know what's the start or the finish, but we can see what the overall cumulative effect is.
Yeah, and you'll also notice if you kind of look at the orientation of the thumbs there, I have my thumbs kind of like pointing towards each other, which puts me into a little more internal rotation, giving me slack in the shoulders to, again, be able to maintain as upright of a position as I can during this time.
One thing though, and this is a thing you can't actually minimize, this is so important, is you definitely have your game face on.
Oh my gosh. It's the face, it's the headband, it's the Nemo shoes that I have going, I've got the whole look.
I am not messing around look here. But we do see here, just kind of bringing it back to topic, using the head as a stabilizer for a shoulder is a thing that we see all over the place. We see that on push-ups, we see that in jerking, snatching. The head is this kind of catch-all thing. When the shoulder does not create 100% of its stability, the next thing upstream and shares a lot of the same musculature is the head and neck. So if your shoulder doesn't solve its problems appropriately, then the head is real easy. You just kind of jam that thing forward and it takes care of the rest of that stability functionally.
So one thing I think this is a good segue into is, what does the role of the head play in allowing weight to stack vertically over the body? Because one of the cues that oftentimes gets repeated in Olympic style weightlifting is head through the bar.
Head through the bar, right?
Head through the bar, expose the head, right? And that allows the weight then to be able to stack comfortably over the traps, which then allows the lats and the rest of the systemic function of the body to be able to support this load.
So I've always maintained that the head and neck are part of the entire spine. If you see a spine, the head is clearly part of that system. So, if we're trying to create global spinal stability and you have one aspect of that that's wildly out of or kind of pushed towards one end range, you create stability whenever you move towards an end range, but what's the trade-off? Like, what else are you doing? And when we see one part, a lot of times then we'll see bigger movement in the thoracic spine on the other direction and maybe a bigger arch into the lumbar spine. So it sort of changes the rest of the spinal mechanics because it's one complete system. And yes, you cannot bring a barbell down from overhead onto your spine if your head is in the way. Like, I'm not advocating that you start smashing your skull with barbells, but we need to kind of solve this.
You might be able to do that once or twice.
Well, and this is one of those things I always said, there's some things you have to learn by doing, and everyone chins themselves with the barbell on a jerk once. I do it once a year, but I'm dumb and I have to learn these lessons over and over. I burn my mouth on pizza often too. So these things I need to relearn occasionally, but it's one of those things where, to be able to push, we need to make sure we're not doing something crazy with the head. I think that, if you're trying to create a stacked system, having the head, I should say, as kind of the thing that stacks on top of that creates a more stable system. And actually, if we go to the next picture, I think you'll see that there's no real trade-off. If we look at head, neck, shoulder position, obviously we can see we still have decent hip and ankle range of motion here. But what we can see here is we brought the shoulders forward actually, and that actually allows you to bring the head in line as well. I don't think there's a trade-off in position here. Yeah, the thumbs are a little more turned out. That helps to create stability here. But what we're seeing there is the whole system is much more upright. Your pelvis is now not tilted. Like before, you were kind of back squatting on the bottom and overhead squatting on the top, and there's just a big kink in the middle of that system. So the head is just part of that overall system. If you were doing this with a barbell, that would be equally stable.
So what I just want to let the audience know here is this photo was maybe taken, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago at this point, up here in San Rafael. And, I have not done a double kettlebell overhead squat since that previous photo that you saw. I think I pulled it off a YouTube video that was dated or time-stamped October 12th, 2012. So it's been almost a decade now since, I've done this movement. And a couple things, if I can experientially kind of feel into, what it was like then versus what it's like now, is this system was like way more stable. Now, back then I was, still chasing performance at a certain level in the sport. And, I was training myself a certain way and maybe not always, the best or being on top of all of my recovery measures. I've since then backed off a lot, no longer chasing performance at that level, training just for fitness enjoyment and also, mental overall wellness. And what that's done, and I'm also much better about my, recovery these days. And so the experience here for me is like, I wasn't quite sure I was going to be able to do this for the shoot. However, having these better positions and going straight down, this felt way more sustainable to me, being able to get all those shots in than it did, 10 years ago.
Absolutely. So, one of the things, just from the therapy side of things, I walk a lot of my cues backwards. This is just our side by side so we can see, why someone reaches out to me is often my neck hurts, or I can't get my upper trap spasm to go away, or my neck locked up and I can't turn my head, or I'm getting chronic headaches from my neck tightness. I'm getting like occipital headaches. So when I look at an athlete like this, I look for those kinds of things because, I've worked this problem in reverse. I want to make sure that this person can take that into a performance standpoint. One of the things I'm looking for is an open circuit. So what I mean by that is if you have kind of a head tilt, or as you throw your head forward, you would ever be able to see a clear line or hinge somewhere in that spine. That's no longer what I would think of as performance. That's kind of now more, it's probably problematic, because and that's just me coming from my background, treating these problems on the therapy table as often as I'm treating them performance-wise, because I see that open circuit leads to problems in the neck, whether that's muscular, whether that's a joint or a cervical disc problem. But you do a lot of this. We see this in like a kipping style pull-up. That was one of those things that caused a lot of problems, is this open head circuit. And again, people are doing it because it helps to stabilize the shoulder. It feels like that allows them some more movement in that position. But then down the road, we see the neck itself starts to pay this cost.
That's interesting that you say that, because in the sport of Olympic style weightlifting, oftentimes what coaches will say is like, use your eyes or look up. And the reasoning behind that is like from a neurological standpoint, our body follows our line of sight. So the example I like to use when I'm working with clients is like, if we're out for a nice jog, on a treadmill side by side, and I start scanning over to talk to you, what I'm going to happen is my body is going to start to drift in that direction. So we borrow that concept, we take it into the sport, and what we find is that if we look up and I'm trying to create verticality or extension in my system, it allows my body to be able to follow my gaze, and suddenly I find that I'm much more open, I'm able to power transfer better, I can then therefore manipulate this momentum to my cause, right? And so eyes ends up following, so because your eyes are set in your head, then what happens is in the setup, we'll see athletes, or we'll coach athletes that have head up, eyes up. And have you found that there's a kind of an acceptable range in which that can occur without taking away performance?
Absolutely. So first, what I want to do is sort of separate out gaze and direction of gaze from head position. And those two things are related, right? If I want to look up, most people are going to look up with their eyes and their head, but you can train one. Like if you're intentional, if I say, keep your head facing me and look over my head, you can use your eyeballs to look up. And that doesn't mean you have to go like this just to look up. And so, we want to sort of start to separate those things out in the same way that, if your hip extension is cued to a lumbar extension, that might be natural in the sense that someone might do that because they haven't been trained not to, or that's just kind of the pattern that feels most powerful to them. But we're still going to try to train that out of that athlete because it's problematic. Even if it's successful early, one, it's not the most powerful way to generate that. It's not stable and sustainable at the upper ends of performance. It starts to break down and create its own performance limitations. And oftentimes that performance limitation is going to be an injury. And how many athletes had good starts to their career, were rapidly progressing, reach a threshold, they stop increasing their performance, and that's when they start occurring injuries. And a lot of times that's because the leak in their game is causing them to just bump up on this performance ceiling. So when I'm looking at that, what I'm looking for is a stable system where all parts are contributing equally. So if I want to look up, I want to look up with thoracic spine, kind of equally all parts. It's okay to have a slightly upright gaze. I don't think anyone when they're jerking is saying, pick a spot directly over your head, look straight up at it and push press. You're really more saying like, I want you to kind of generally be looking in that direction, because if you're looking down, we're going to start to hinge forward. And now you're losing that verticality that allows us really good force transfer up, correct? So what I'm thinking is like, let's pick a position and let's train it, and let's make sure that you're not using the head as a workaround for instability in the shoulder, which is this kind of punch through thing, or you're using your head like that as a way of cueing yourself to go up, when really you should be thinking that with your whole body.
Right. So what I'm hearing here is like, we're trying to uncouple the idea of like head and eyes being, isolated fixed systems on top of a floating body and using that as a driver.
Exactly.
And what we're moving people into is this idea of global extension as a mechanism.
Exactly. And you should feel, so, if you look at this system, this is an extension driven system. You can see the whole thing is almost in an arc here, and the head is just part of that. Right, it's this kind of thing.
That was beautiful.
Right? Do you like that? It's just as good.
It was a dramatic recreation of my position. I loved it.
And what you think there is, if you're trying to go out of this overextension into a more vertical position, like you're demonstrating here, you don't have to take your head from here back to here. Right. You just bring the whole system upright, and it's this, kind of Pilates informed kind of. Imagine there's this line pulling you in both directions. You're not trying to just over retract because you over protracted one time.
Right.
You're just trying to bring everything vertical, and that's what creates the best stability in that system globally. So I think that that's a way that we can cue athletes in a way that's safe and sustainable for the long term. without them necessarily having to sacrifice performance. I think it actually should unlock some of those performance barriers while making that head and neck position more stable and sustainable over the long term.
I like that. And also just to, put out there that if this is your dedicated profession or sport, listen to your coach. However, for the rest of us here that are just borrowing from this practice to be able to live your life, right? These ideas being presented today are things that is going to allow for sustainability over the long term.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Sean.
Absolutely.